We now reach the final keynote address of this conference, and I'm absolutely delighted that ICA welcomes Michael Every from Rabobank. Michael is well known to many people in this audience. He's spoken at many conferences before, widely published, widely read, and with a very interesting strategic vision. Michael's going to talk about the shifting sands of global trade. I want to just explain, we would have had Michael at the lead at the start of this conference, but the programs of other speakers just prevented this, because this is in many respects a scene setter for the global commercial environment in which we all exist. Michael is based here in East Asia. He has more than 25 years experience, both as an economist and a strategist. And he also hails from the most recent addition to the UK Premier League. And for all those advocates of British football, you'll be very familiar with Luton Town, which is Michael's hometown. So, Michael, thank you very much for joining us. We look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Well, a late good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for attending. And the presentation title that I've got for you today, in the 30 minutes that I've got, is the Shifting Sands of Global Trade. And my warning to you is you shouldn't be building your castle on it. And looking around, we lucky few who are going to hear that message, please do spread it to the others. I think they'll be jealous they don't get to hear it, to be honest. So let's move very swiftly on. We've had quite the shifting sands in terms of global trade in the backdrop. And to be blunt, we've done a fairly good job of predicting it at Rabobank. If you look at some of the reports we've been putting out since 2016, I don't know if any of these are familiar to you, but basically they predicted nearly everything that we've seen unfolding in the past few years, to do a bit of self-promotion there. So please do read our research if you're lucky enough to get it. But there's much, much more coming our way. Much more sand is blowing in our direction. In terms of trade, we've got warnings of a US retreat from free trade over China. We've got even more strongly worded warnings that the US is seeing a return to potential autarky. Now, that's a complete exaggeration, but we are moving in a new direction we haven't seen for a long time. And that sand is swirling around us when we look at what might be coming politically in the next few years in America. The Financial Times warning America's new right is moving beyond Reaganism. Absolutely. Also something else we've predicted. And if you look at some of the policy stances of the next generation of the Republican Party, which will eventually take over, they're talking about totally eliminating the US trade deficit, moving manufacturing back to the US, making everything in America again by paying people enough money to do it, and with automation if necessary. I'm not saying it's achievable, I'm saying they want to do it. That upends everything about how you guys do business. Meanwhile, before we get there, the US is also beginning to impose capital controls, the flow of money, into China, and from Chinese money into the US. Now that's important because the capital account is the inverse of the trade account. If you're an economist, you know that. If you can't move money from one country to another, you won't trade with them. You can't do the financing. That's starting to happen. Huge implications there. And we have other dust clouds blowing towards us, even from free traders like Europe. Look at that red line. That's Chinese production of automobiles and exports. Absolutely incredible performance, particularly in the EV sector. Europe, the most free trader of free traders, now says they're probably going to put tariffs up to keep Chinese goods out. And solar panels, and wind turbines, and we can keep adding to the list. It will keep growing. Then, elsewhere, we see within China, they're looking to expand farmland to stop buying foreign food. They're talking about buying iron ore not from Australia, but from Africa in the next few years. We're seeing exactly the same trend everywhere we look, because if someone's doing it, you have to copy them or you get left out. And just have a look here at all these key commodities and value-added products such as semiconductors, and look at the controls that we are seeing being put on them all the time. India has just added sugar to that list, by the way, just in the past few days, I believe. And while occasionally one drops off, far more are being added all the time. And within your sector, well, look, you know all about this. You're the cotton guys. I'm not a cotton guy. You're very familiar with the fact that politics can start getting involved in what used to be just a simple commodity, like cotton. It can operate in one way, as you can see here from this headline, and then you find workarounds, and everything tries to continue the way it was. But the whole point is politics will be interjecting itself into the commercial process more and more and more going forward. But here's a bigger picture part of what's going on that maybe you aren't aware of that I want to unpack for you a little bit. We have had headlines for quite some time talking about an anti-dollar axis. Or, as the Financial Times puts it here, China capitalizing on US sanctions in a fight to dethrone the dollar. That's a rather large headline. That's a rather dramatic headline. And let me tell you, that's a very, very dramatic development if we see anything like this starting to happen. So let me start to unpack it. Are we seeing a decline in the use of the US dollar internationally? Well, no, not on some metrics. These are world reserves of FX that central banks keep for emergencies. And if you look at the dark blue slice of that pyramid, you can see it's still the US dollar that's the king. So when you're trading, it's still in the dollar. You demand payment in dollars. Your pricing is in dollars for cotton. If we look at the share of transactions within the SWIFT international banking network, the dollar is again doing really well. Look at the dark blue line. Look at it going up. Can you see the light blue line falling off of a cliff? That's the euro. So actually, we don't have de-dollarization on that metric. We have de-euroization, which is quite ironic because a lot of my European colleagues were telling me they expected the dollar to be doing that and the euro to be going up. How wrong they were. But globally, this is a time of change. Tides come in, tides go out. The sands shift. Look at the share of world GDP there, accounted for by dark blue economies, which is the G7 and the developed economies, versus emerging markets in red. Can you see the tides of history shifting? As they shift, is it going to remain a US dollar world? That's the question. Well, we have a lot of people talking about the BRICS, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. Many people here are probably from BRICS members. That's just expanded to the BRICS 11, bringing in, of course, Egypt and several others, including Iran. And we've seen headlines talking about US-China rivalry, which we all know about, emerging new orders, Xi Jinping not going to the G20 to snub it, Xi being done with the world order, and blueprints for a new world order, which is obviously expected to revolve around the BRICS 11 here. What can we say about that? A lot. Because headlines are one thing, analysis, which is what I try and do, is something very different. If we look at total world trade there, the OECD, which is basically the G7 plus friends, is the dark blue lump. Light blue is the rest of the world, and the BRICS 11, intra-BRICS 11 trade, is that red slice. So the BRICS 11 are huge in terms of population, in terms of commodity production, in terms of GDP, and they trade almost nothing internally. I'm going to try and show that in several other different ways. But before I get to that key point, I want to stress this. Have a look at the screen here. What we've got top left is China, Latin America trade, and China, Middle Eastern trade on the top right. And I've broken the trade down by category: imports into China, exports from China, and by primary, resource-based, low-tech, medium-tech, high-tech, and unclassified. This is called analysis. If you look at it, you can see a fairly clear picture. China and Latin America, imports and exports are reasonably well balanced, but what you import and export are extremely different. Raw materials come in, like cotton, value-added materials go out. Middle East, raw materials come in, energy, value-added materials go out the other way. What we are talking about with a BRICS 11 trade network that wants to de-dollarize is this: netting out trade bilaterally within that particular network to avoid using the US dollar so you don't get caught with any potential trade sanctions. And effectively, you are talking about de facto bilateral barter, which is nominally priced in dollars, but then transacted with swaps of goods. That's what's being proposed and is starting to emerge at the margin. At the same time, the People's Bank of China is actively promoting the renminbi as a potential invoicing and settlement currency for commodities, and it's providing TCF, trade commodity finance, in buckets for people to try and switch over to doing that. And they hope over time they'll build enough scale that actual pricing shifts away from dollars to the renminbi. This upends everything if it starts to happen. And it is happening to a certain degree post-Ukraine. For example, if we look here on the right-hand side, you can see the US dollar share of trade commodity finance has dropped from around 90% to 84%. It still dominates. On the left-hand axis, you can see the renminbi has gone up from 2 to 4, 4.5. That's the result of what happened between Europe and Russia in particular post-Ukraine. So the renminbi is miles behind the dollar, but it's starting to go up quickly, and we could be potentially seeing a tipping point in some geographies. But here's where I'm going to have to get quite technical. This looks very science fiction. I'm very proud of this chart. It took a lot of work to put together. Let me try and talk you through it. What it actually shows you here is intra-BRICS 11 trade compared to the OECD last year as a percentage of their total trade. So the higher you go, that's the higher percentage of your total trade. What you can see is everything red, again, is intra-BRICS 11, and it's low compared to their total trade. With the OECD, it's really high. So what am I saying? At the moment, what I just showed you isn't happening in trade flows. So if we do see that, it will have a dramatic rebalancing effect compared to where we see trade flows right now. But here's the really important point, and a lot of people don't pick up on this. They look at the previous chart and say, can't happen, no network effect, it's not going to work. Well, think of Shakespeare. Anyone remember The Merchant of Venice with the pound of flesh? That was dangerous because if you take a pound of flesh from some parts of the body, it will hurt, but you can walk away. If you take it from some parts, you die immediately. That pound, where you apply it, matters much, much more than in others. And that's exactly what I think the BRICS 11 are trying to do. Because if you look at this similar chart here, intra-BRICS 11 upstream exports versus the OECD as a percentage of total exports, you can see they control exports of upstream products to the OECD. So we're talking energy, we're talking cotton, we're talking lots of things. Now, why does that matter? Because effectively, it's like the bargain between labor and capital within the economy, which we're having now, which will settle where wages go and where inflation goes and where interest rate goes. It's a big political battle. It's not just an economic one. So the dollar could potentially find itself being covered in the sand as this battle rages. For example, China is talking about a new electronic settlement platform called mBridge. Not SWIFT, which you're all used to using day in, day out, but mBridge, which is going to be launched fairly soon, and some countries in the region here will be early members. What's important about this, it's not just an alternative trading platform and settlement platform. They want to link it to not just TCF, but CBDC. Now, does anyone know what CBDC is? Probably not. Not a heavy metal band. Central bank digital currency, where the central bank creates an electronic token, like Bitcoin, owned by the government, which is on your phone or in an app, not in your bank account, to tell you where you can and can't spend money. You can only go in this account or in this area or in that area. Programmable, controllable money. And China intends to link mBridge with CBDC. So government X can issue this amount of money, which can only be used for category A, B, or C, and flows in mBridge rather than between two investment banks. It really, really upends things. Really, really upends things. Now that would allow BRICS 11 clearing through this system completely separate to the banking system you use today. It wouldn't change international trade flows immediately, but if that clearing system changes, everything else will have to flow back down. It would upend absolutely everything. And for the BRICS, if you've then got the central bank creating money, which they are, and telling you exactly where it can go, which it will, you have industrial policy, i.e. we want to put the money into this industry which will use that raw material to produce this output which we know we're going to sell to them because they're our friends. That's exactly how it will be, a planned or semi-planned economy. And that would be an entirely parallel system to SWIFT, to the dollar, and to the global economy that we have today for everything, including cotton. I can see some furrowed brows even in the dark crowd out there, and I can tell you, yes, you should be furrowing your brow because this does change everything that you do completely. So let's take a bar of chocolate as an example, because at Rabo we deal with a lot of food clients, obviously. Everyone likes a nice bar of chocolate. What happens if the oil and the diesel, the cocoa, the palm oil, the sugar, the nuts, all of those ingredients are in a new BRICS 11 CBDC, but you want to sell it for dollars or euros? And there's no way to change dollars and euros for this new CBDC because it's on a different system. What are you going to do? Well, you can break the chocolate in half. Absolutely. Or you have two parallel systems, two parallel economies, two parallel accounting systems, two parallel supply chains, two parallel markets. That's exactly what would have to happen. Imagine that's a T-shirt which is priced in terms of the oil, the diesel, the cotton in BRICS 11 CBDC, and you want to sell it for dollars in America, and you can't. And you want to sell it for euros, and you can't. Who are you going to sell it to? Now I can see people really starting to furrow their brows. This is the world we're moving towards. We may not have planned it out, but that's where we're heading. So please, don't be like this guy here, which accounts for most people in the financial industry. Understand that what we actually have in the background here is a big political battle between two things. Top left, we have the US financial system, which is about $20 trillion. It's huge, absolutely huge. Then we have the euro-dollar financial system. Now, what do I mean by euro-dollar? I mean US dollars that you use outside the US. Hands up, anyone here who's used US dollars who isn't a US citizen? Okay, not everyone's put their hands up, which means you're lying. Because you all do it every day in your business. You are using euro dollars. Think about it. You're using the currency of another country which you take to be money good, trustworthy, reliable. You can move it wherever you want. It's not your money, it's their money. But if anything goes wrong in that system, if we have a crisis like in 2008, for example, you expect the regulator to step in. You expect someone to help you. Help me. Who? Your own government? They don't have any dollars. They're not America. If you're not American and you're using US dollars and there's a crisis, why the hell should they help you? It's a serious question. I'll be coming back to it in a moment, but that's part of what we are seeing playing out in the background here between people who want to stick with the dollar and the presumption the Americans will help them in a quid pro quo, and those who actually want to use, if you look at the picture, commodities instead. So when you go to the bank, you don't say, I've got $100 million of assets or $100 million of cash. Will you lend me $1 billion so I can do business? You'll say, I've got a ship full of oil over there. How much is that worth? How many CBDC will you give me for that? I've got a future crop of cotton. How much will you give me for that in CBDC? That's the battle that's about to take place. So, if this is the global dollar system, it is a mighty high castle. And let me stress, nothing can replace the dollar globally. If we have one world economy, one world system, we'll have one world currency, and there will be no replacement. There is not a snowball's or a sandcastle's chance in hell of the Chinese currency, the Russian currency, anyone's currency ever replacing that. Ever. But you can smash it. You can absolutely smash it. You can't replace it with anything, but you can knock it down. And if you do that, the global system can crumble and fragment, and all of our lives become infinitely more complicated. And that might suit some people. That's certainly what they're trying to achieve. We've seen it in history. In the 1930s, prior to World War II, the gold standard collapsed and we saw different global blocks emerging. Some kept using gold, some used the dollar, some used sterling, some used the Reichsmark, some used the Japanese yen, some used the Soviet ruble. Guess what? Very, very little trade between them. There was no clearing system. You couldn't take Soviet rubles and use them in Germany for Reichsmarks. You couldn't use paper money in the gold bloc. So trade networks had to completely restructure themselves. Now, that's much harder to do today because industry has spread supply chains by slice all around the world. In the old days, industries were horizontal within geographies. So it would be much more complicated to try and unscramble those eggs. But that's where we're risking. And then you have to consider this. I don't know if you recognize this guy. I'm not going to try and sing the song, much as I like having a sing when I've got a microphone in front of me. It's a damn shame, but trade policy really does drive global inequality. There's a reason why this guy was on YouTube recently singing about rich men north of Richmond and wailing about unemployment and poverty and despair. It's because of free trade. If you move all the jobs where they're cheap, people lose their jobs in the West, people get angry, you get Donald Trump and worse. That's not going to change. Free trade doesn't work the way we structured it. We see that now. Uncomfortable but true. So the West understands that. And when it looks at what's happening with this BRICS 11 grouping on top, well, they realize we need to reverse policy. Let's stop being idiots and trying to make housing more expensive all the time and pretend the best way to get rich is to have your house price going up, which is madness. Madness. Let's actually try and have some production. Let's make things again. Do you remember when the West used to make things? I vaguely do. They kind of stopped doing it when I was quite young. Well, we're going to have to start doing it again. Absolutely. More so now that we see an unstable geopolitical environment around us. And indeed, we've done research on this, predicting headlines like the ones you see on the screen here. The West needs to learn to make everything again. And I mean everything from upstream to downstream. But when we get nearshoring, friendshoring, and onshoring, which I heard being referred to this morning, which are, they are happening. They really are, faster than you think, industry by industry. That will become more of a politically driven process and more of a geopolitical process where instead of you looking for where else is cheap, governments will be telling you, we want you to go here because they're our friends. We don't want you to go there. But we estimate 28 million jobs will leave China. Now, that doesn't sound very many compared to the Chinese population. Proportionately, that's a larger deindustrialization than America saw vis-a-vis China and Mexico. So China can automate to a large degree, and it will, but a lot of industry, and I'm talking in textiles too, is going to go everywhere else in the world. And the issue is it within BRICS 11, or is it in other countries where the West steers the way? Now, the BIS, the Bank for International Settlements, they just did a really, really big detailed dive into this. I'm not going to read that out word for word. But their conclusion was, what you've seen so far in terms of this US-China decoupling really has just inserted a middleman between the two. So effectively, let's say, for example, textile processing has moved from China to some degree to Bangladesh or Vietnam, but it's still Chinese looms going into Vietnam or Bangladesh, it's still Chinese yarn, and it's still Chinese processed upstream materials before they get there, and very little value add is added by stitching before it then goes on somewhere else. So that's what they think decoupling has meant so far. The optimistic view, and I don't mean optimistic from my point of view, I mean if you're status quo anti, is that that's as far as it can go, that's as far as we can decouple. The realist view, which I've been arguing all along, is yes, that's the first stage, then the looms will move. Then everything upstream will move, and you will have parallel systems, because that's absolutely the political dynamic coming from both sides. Both sides. They may not say it, it's what they're doing. So the WTO is now warning about fragmentation into trade blocs. Well, guess who's been showing that slide of historical fragmentation since 2016? Me. We've also had the ECB talking about the war in Ukraine being a pivotal moment, an epochal moment that's shifting supply chains. Well, that was last year. That's so last year, because things really are shifting much more dramatically. We've got constant concern over Taiwan and semiconductors. Now, it's not cotton, but obviously things will change dramatically if both sides start playing for semiconductors for real there. But we have lots and lots of other similar headlines, including in this region, of strategic partnerships and new comprehensive strategic partnerships, which are all defense related. But after you've got the defense deal, that's when you suddenly start seeing the trade deals on the back of it. And if you're not getting a defense deal, how long are your trade deals going to last? And I tell you, not very long. Not when push comes to shove. And then, of course, you've got just complete instability. 4 anti-Western coups in Africa this year so far. Who's next? I don't know, but there's plenty more to go. Plenty more to go, just destabilizing that entire region. And this isn't an accident. This isn't happening in a vacuum. It's part of a plan. And then you see the West trying to assemble something as some kind of counter-challenge, particularly to China's Belt and Road. The US and India and Saudi and the EU were going to launch a big trade corridor. Anyone remember that? A few weeks ago? Did you see those headlines? Turkey said, no, it should run through Turkey. Well, congratulations, Iran. You just destroyed that. Excuse the emotion in my voice, but the feelings are still very raw for a lot of us here. That's an image from this weekend. I'm not going to talk about it anymore because I'll choke up. But well done. You've just destroyed that. You've destroyed a hell of a lot. And that is going to be an accelerant to change on a scale with Ukraine, broader than Ukraine, because it's running parallel with Ukraine. And in fact, the concern is, where next? And there will be a next, unfortunately. If we look at what's happening in the region, you can see that unfortunately the concentric circles of sand are very likely to spread out. And you can see here, some of these countries would be considered pro-Western, some of them pro-BRICS. So that dividing line is absolutely going to run through the middle. No one knows exactly where the bombs will be dropping or how bad the damage could get, but it could get extremely, extremely severe. It's difficult. You can project some scenarios where everyone, one way or another, can get sucked into this directly or indirectly. So when we think of, let's call it in the broadest terms, the Holy Land, let's pray for the best. That's the best thing we can say, I think. But trying to move it back to economics, because that's supposed to be where I am, but economics is political now. Even if the US doesn't fight directly with 2 aircraft carriers heading for the region, and I'm not sure if they do actually want to use them in an election year, between you and me. I don't think they do. They're going to use economic weapons against the new constellation that we see appearing in the background. They're going to keep interest rates high. Everyone's been shocked by how high interest rates have gone. They're going to stay high because that props up the dollar against BRICS 11 currencies, and I'll come back to them in a moment. They also want to see commodity prices going down. Why? So that people don't expect them to keep going up and use them as the base of a collateral funding pyramid rather than the dollar. If your commodities are going to get cheaper every year, hold dollars. You get 5.5% interest on dollars. You get nothing on commodities if the price is going down. The US wants to really blunt shadow banking. Anyone trading dollars outside the US, you're a shadow bank. You're doing banking, trading dollars outside the US, but you're not a US bank. They want to absolutely show you who's boss. And if something goes wrong because of 5.5% interest rates, whether it's a big global commodity trader suddenly getting squeezed, the US is not going to bail everybody out. This isn't going to be 2008 where they save everybody. They're going to say, who's my friend and who isn't? Who gets dollar liquidity and who doesn't? Who walks away and who doesn't? And that's coming up soon. So let's go back to those BRICS 11 currencies. This is based to 2010 being worth 100, so you can see them all on the same axis. But if you look at the red one at the top, people are talking about a weak renminbi. That's actually one of the better performers, which it's not doing very well. Argentina at the bottom, I haven't updated this for a week. Argentina is already deep in that hole. It's actually gone even lower. It continues to collapse. Everything there is collapsing. Overnight, Russia put in place capital controls because the ruble is collapsing. This is part of the game that's being played out. Expect a lot more of it. And as I said to you, as that happens, things start to crumble. That castle starts to crumble. don't go running to the US and say, do we get help, if you haven't done something for the US lately. You've done something for the US lately? There they go, they'll help you. You haven't? Good luck to you. So, starting to move towards the conclusion here now, and then I believe opening up for Q&A, industrial supply chains are already shifting. Soft supply chains can shift less and that you can't grow everything everywhere, but they will move with politics, I do believe. Institutional shifts in terms of payment systems and how we process things are going to complicate commodity trading. What are you going to do if you grow a crop and you've got two sets of customers with two different payment systems coming in? Are you going to be free to make that choice? Are you going to be told by your government which one of the payment systems you can and can't use? I don't know. All these scenarios are possible. So we can simplify it. Stay in your lane. Great. Which one's my lane? I think we kind of know most of the time, but elections can shift it. There are certain large economies over the next 12 months where we could see elections move from one camp to another. But the shifting sands of global trade are where a lot of sand is right now, the Middle East, and there's a very violent shift underway there. And on that note, I will thank you very much for your kind attention. I apologize if it's a lot to take in before lunch, but that's all from me and open to questions. Thank you very much.